Glenn Loury here. This is the Glenn Show. Glenn and John, we're the black guys at bloggingheads.tv. Okay, in fact, we're underway at the Glenn Show. Glenn Loury, bloggingheads.tv and the Glenn Show at patreon.com. And I'm with Cornel West, the iconic public intellectual African-American activist and philosopher, and with Teodros Kiros, who is himself a philosopher of distinction, the host of a television show and the author of many important books and essays. He teaches at the Berklee School of Music, and I've known him for over 30 years. And we're here to discuss their book, Conversations with Cornel West. That is a small compendium of transcripts of discussions between Teodros and Cornel about deep philosophical questions relevant to the African-American experience and the African experience. So with that introduction, welcome Teodros, welcome Cornel to the Glenn Show. Man, I cannot believe that I have Cornel West on the Glenn Show. I'm excited, I'm excited. Thank you for coming on, and thank you, Teodros, for suggesting this conversation.
My pleasure, Cornel.
Well, it's always a blessing to be in conversation with you. I've been learning from you for over 40 years, and I continue to learn from you.
Kind of you to say, I'm a conservative, Cornel.
Yeah, conservatives got insights too, my brother.
I'm a lapsed Christian.
Are you lapsed though? We got to work on that.
I'm trying to reflect on this in the context of this memoir that I've been working on for a long time, but that's coming out in the spring of next year.
That's interesting.
My relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ has waned, and I'm in a deep reflection, self-reflection about the meaning of that. And I just read this book by Os Guinness, who's arguing that the book of Exodus is the Magna Carta of humanity. I think that's the title of the book, the Magna Carta of humanity. I'm struggling with my faith questions and with the existential questions, but I fell away from the church, yeah.
Oh, nothing wrong to fall away from the church. You just don't want to fall away from the love, but that's what this book is about. You want to fall away from the love. You don't want to fall away from the kenosis, from the emptying of yourself and giving of your gifts to the least of these as a way of being in the world. That's what it means to follow a Palestinian Jew named Jesus. That has nothing to do with the church for the most part, little to do with Christianity, you see.
Well, this is going to be a personal confessional here to a certain degree. And since we've gone in this direction, and Teodros, I so thank you for being patient with us. My beloved Lawan Loury, you met her at Brown University.
Oh, yeah.
She is a recovering Seventh-day Adventist who was scarred by you know what I'm talking about, by this kind of thing that happens, this obsessive control thing, and this and has completely, I'm not even going to say forsaken. I mean, the bitterness, and this is not criticism of her in any way whatsoever.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, in this space that she and I occupy together of spirituality.
Yes.
I'm not on this journey by myself. Maybe that's what I'm saying. And it's a hard road, man. No, indeed. No, I understand that. But I mean, you read St. Francis of Assisi, you read St. John on the Dark Night of the Soul, and you read the blues artists who held on to a love and a Jesus that had little to do with the institutional dogmatism and the narrowness of certain Christian practices. And all I'm saying is that the sense of the centrality of kenosis, of a love that is outpouring, of John 1:14, the word made flesh and came to dwell among us. That's always going to call into question any kinds of institutional church practices that lose sight of the love power of the resurrection story. That's the key that I'm talking about, you see. And you and her have that love. It's the very love itself that constitutes the basis of the critique of the source of the scars. Does that make sense, brother?
Yeah, it's very powerful. It's very powerful, and it reminds me of the book Love and Coltrane. It reminds me of that,
yes.
of that dimension of this conversation. But it does not answer all questions, and it calls me to faith. I gotta believe it's gonna be okay at the end of the day, because I don't really see all the way to the end of the day.
Oh, nobody does. That's what 1 Corinthians 13 is all about. We see partially. We live the questions. That's real, okay. We don't have the answer. The Christian faith is the living of the questions. It's not the providing of the answers, but the love itself is the very means through which, given the flesh that we are, given the flesh that Jesus was, allows us to sustain ourselves through the darkness. The darkness is not denied. We have strength to go through it. That's what Teodros and I talk about in this text.
So I have a cover story, and then I kind of have the real story about my own falling away. So the cover story is I had an administrative assistant, a wonderful woman, Sherry DuPont. And she was 42 years old, had just made law review, having finished her first year at law school. She worked for me for 5 or 6 years. Was very invested in my little Institute on Race and Social Division at Boston University back in the day, back in the 90s. And got to law school, man, and finished the first year. I can still see her pulling a book bag behind her as she walked around the campus in an overall thing, getting focused on her 42-year-old law career. Made law review and got a viral infection in her heart and died just like that, died within months. I mean, we knew she was sick, and then we knew she was and then she was dead, man. And that there was her funeral, and her funeral was at an AME church in the center of Cambridge. I'm sure you've been in it. I think I may have even seen you in it.
Oh, yeah.
And man, dancing around, God's not dead, he's still alive. I can remember them singing those hymns, man. I can remember meeting her mother and her mother telling me, it's okay, she's with Jesus. And I thought, and this is the cover story, I don't think it's the real story, but it's what I've been telling myself. I thought at that moment, my God, there is no account for this. There is no easy answer to this. This is the abyss. It goes all the way down. And we won't look into it. We're too busy in our emotionality, and we want to spare ourselves the agony of the existential condition in which we in fact find ourselves, of which this woman's demise was merely one instance. It's unserious. It's unserious philosophically. It's unserious ethically. It's an easy way out, I thought. I was driven from that church to looking for my Nietzsche. Cornel, I'm sorry to have to report that. But the cover story is in my rationality. I don't believe in magic. A man raised from the dead, come on. I mean, I understand the power of the myth, but don't ask me to actually believe that. There's no extra material force that's at play that's making fate. There's nothing wrong with us gathering in communities of love, but don't ask me to believe that. I got a PhD from MIT. You understand what I'm saying? So, but that's a cover story is what I'm saying. It was just too easy for me to say that, and I'm still twisting in the wind out here, and I don't quite know what to do.
No, but I think in many ways, when we refer to Dostoevsky in this text, because Dostoevsky is saying exactly what you're saying, but he's saying that as a Christian, right? The Brother Karamazov is the most powerful indictment, not just of Christian practice, but also of Christian belief, or what you were calling certain kind of supernatural formulations. But he remains a Christian. Why? Because he knows that there is a finitude, there is a fallibility, there is a fallenness in all of his perceptions. And he also doesn't want to in any way to view reason or rationality as an idol. That's why your PhD at MIT don't mean that much when it comes to dealing with death, dread, despair, and disappointment and disease. Because the rationalist is not in any way, the empiricist is not in any way, the scientist is not in any way privileged to deal with what the poet's been talking about all the time. Isn't this what we're wrestling with, Teodros?
Exactly right. That's what I did, Cornel. That's right. And additionally, Cornel, we also address the issue of nihilism.
Absolutely. That's what Brother Glenn is wrestling with. And you can't deny it. You can't be in denial about it. But at the same time, when you come out on the other side in the darkness and grimness, you can't in any way think that there is a way out. We are locked in the midst, in the funk, in what Samuel Beckett called the mess, in time and space and history. And the best we can do is to come up with examples tied to traditions and stories that help us get through. And at that point, it's not a question of simply, believing X or Y. It's a question of how your soul is fortified in order to get through. And you don't get through based on any stories. You don't get through based on superstition, but you don't get through based on any kind of rational certainty or any kind of narrow scientificity either.
This is interesting. We have to have these stories.
Absolutely.
The stories are the salve. They're the way that we survive. They're the way that we maintain hope.
That's right.
It's why we keep trying. Why would we not despair and simply throw up our hands? Now, I see what you're saying. It's very powerful.
Absolutely. Because the thing is, we're already living in a moment of such spiritual decay and moral and cultural breakdown, where the structures of value and feeling have been so flattened out by the market, where survival of the slickest was obsession with status and spectacle rather than moral substance and ethical content. And then the question becomes, well, how then do we connect with one another in such a way that we can pass the best of these traditions on to our children? And these are not issues of abstract character. They have to do with the very ways in which we and our children and our grandmothers and fathers were able to get up every day in order to sustain themselves over against death, dread, despair, disappointment, white supremacy, predatory capitalism, hatred, greed, all the different hounds of hell that come pounding against us as the finite creatures that we are in the world.
Additionally, too, if I may,
You certainly may.
We might also want to briefly broach what I call the question of the crisis of American democracy, which is profoundly linked with the phenomena that Cornel was just beginning to address, the commodification of the self, the deprivation of fundamentally essential human resources that human beings as human beings must necessarily be entitled to, which is linked to a systematic deprivation of human beings who happen to be dark-skinned, who do not have access to these material resources, a point that that Glenn, with his brilliance diagnosis of the crises of democracy within African-American life, is also a special instance of. So to understand what Glenn quite rightly calls distorted pathologies in the African-American lives, we must address the prior question of the crisis of democracy itself in and among the practitioners of American political life.
Okay, let me slow us down a little bit. I didn't mean to interrupt you, though. If you were not finished, please conclude.
I'm done.
No, because I want to summarize and I want to put some structure on it, because not everybody's going to be able to follow all the. So I hear on the one hand an issue of the commercialization, commodification, a decay of spirit, a lack of appreciation of the humanity of people, a loss of contact with their suffering, et cetera, and a kind of alienation in the social spirit, which is implicated in the nihilism. Now, when we say nihilism, what we're talking about is what Cornel was talking about in Race Matters, which he got so much flack for talking about in Race Matters back in the day, which was what's going on amongst African Americans, the violence in our community. Come on, we cannot look away from that violence. We cannot ignore that. That's pathos, man. That's loss. That's human suffering. That is in our midst. That's happening right now. I'm not giving up politics when I say that. I'm trying to maintain contact with reality, with that mother who's grieving over that little casket in that storefront Pentecostal church where the boy has been gunned down in some drive-by. That is happening on a daily basis. You don't have to be left or right or anything like that to be in touch with that. We cannot lose touch with that. On the other hand,
That's right.
we can't pathologize Black people. That would be the way I put it. And I have used the word pathology because the level of the violence and what's going on is pathological, in my opinion. Although we cannot pathologize Blackness, we cannot pathologize the Black experience. So that point, and we have to situate it. We have to situate it within the larger forces, among which are economic and political and institutional forces. We have to situate it. I'm granting all of that, but I still have a point. We are responsible for how we live. We are responsible for how we raise our children. I'm talking about Black people. We have to take responsibility for our lives. It is far too seductive to allow the narrative, the story that we had used to interpret our experience, to become solely and singly our victimization. This is a deep mistake. It's a political mistake. More importantly, it's a spiritual mistake. It's an existential mistake.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we cannot allow the machinations of the forces up here to impede our embrace of that responsibility. And we cannot allow the narrative in the service of transitory political interests to obscure the responsibilities that are at stake here in our community. So I want you to situate my concern just expressed within both the failure of democracy point that you're making about the forces up here and the commercialization, commodification point that you're making, which too are valid points. But I think the clock is ticking on Black people in America. The world is not standing still, and I'll stop. I know I'm making a speech, but I really want you to react to it. The Chinese are coming. American empire, as Cornel is fond of putting it, will not last forever.
That's true.
Black people are in no position to miss an opportunity to realize the full productive possibilities of our human potential. And that is not happening now.
You were absolutely right, though, brother. See, for me, the talk about victimhood on the one hand and agency on the other is really a certain way of talking about how do we stay in contact with the rich, complicated humanity of Black people. Now, you see, just to take Black humanity for granted is such a radical act because most people don't want to stay in contact with it. A lot of people want to stay in contact just with the good stuff. The other people want to stay in contact just with the ugly stuff. Well, all that stuff goes together. And so when you stay in contact with the humanity of Black people, you can never view Black people solely victims, though you're not concerned with the truth, because we're not solely victims. We're always fighting. We're always coping. We're always creatively responding. But are we getting crushed? Yes. Are we crushing each other too often? Yes. Are the men crushing women too often? Yes. Are the straights are the middle class doing in the poor folk too often? Yes. All those realities have to be unflinchingly confronted. And it's so easy to be in denial on one side or the other. Structural or behavioral, individual or institutional, class, gender, sexual orientation, or even in the national sense, in terms of imperial, right? Our relation to Haiti, our relation to Brazil, our relation to whatever it is. Palestine, mediated with various Jewish elites, but still subordination, domination, and so forth. And this is where the Christian witness comes in again, though, brother. And I just want to keep bringing this out, because when you talked about how difficult it is to believe in a resurrection, if you look at what has happened in your own life and in my own life, given where we were, where we are now, that's a miracle. We about to go and believe in miracles because it's already been working in our own minds and hearts and souls and families. We've seen the power of love change people's lives, including changing our lives. That's part of the narrative in that sense. But to stay in contact with the humanity of Black people, means you're gonna get in trouble because you're gonna be over against somebody else's conception of narrowing Black humanity, either to just victimhood or just creative response or just a certain conception of Blackness that's too narrow and too dogmatic, but can be easily weaponized in order for individual career or middle-class status or whatever it is. We just got to be committed to the truth. Period. And that means it's going to come at us. Truth, uncompromisingly spoken, always has ragged edges against ourselves. The very people who speak it are going to be called into question. So when Brother Glenn said, well, he's conservative, he's progressive, you trying to stay in contact with the truth. And that's what I love about you. And then when I think that you're losing contact, I come at you. You think I'm losing contact? You come at me with a smile, with some music, and with some serious contestation. Hey, that's the way it ought to be.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Teodros, please.
And of course, I must truly admire Glenn for this incredible summary that he gave of what I attempted to say. And now, additionally, Cornel, in numerous speeches that you've given in the past, because you're a truth-seeking individual, you've always acknowledged and admired what you call the conservative insight, which is embodied in the courageous contributions of the great Glenn, which leads me now to steer the direction of the conversation to the discussion of love supreme, in particular, and most generally, music as such, in which the cries, the sorrows, the sufferings of people of African descent is embodied. And I can't think of anyone else other than Cornel who has addressed this issue most brilliantly. So brilliantly that I even encouraged them in the little book. I know he's quite busy to consider writing a very important work on the philosophy of music. So Cornel, why don't we go to Love Supreme and to the articulation of the cries of Black people, which is embodied in their musics.
Well, I want to give Brother Glenn a chance to both respond and reflect, but I also want to make sure that we talk about Love Supreme, both from Coltrane's version and other versions as well. But Brother Glenn, you jump in first, and then I'll say something about Coltrane Love Supreme and how it connects to the issue of Black humanity.
Yeah, I wanted to contextualize the discussion about Black humanity and about the presumption of a denial of the Black humanity. I mean, I wanted to tell a certain narrative about the history of the last 75 years here in the United States with respect to African Americans, which is much more triumphalist than it is defeatist. It would include the election of Barack Hussein Obama to the presidency of the United States, as complex and problematic in many dimensions as that is. And I know you would have a lot to say about that if we were talking about that. It would include the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s canonization, and the civic narrative that's developed around him as it relates to the founding of the country and the philosophies of liberal democracy and all of that, and integrating and the contestation over the 1619 Project and things of this kind, the situation of African Americans striving within the American National Project and how it would relate to the diasporic situation of Black people relative to the whole historical dynamics since 1500, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to situate it because I think the glass is way more than half full. I think the fact that chattel slaves become citizens of the country, I am not excusing anything when I say this. I'm putting it within 1,000 years of political history, become citizens of the country within a century, so much so that they can have outsized influence on, and we do have, on the culture of this country. We drive a lot of national narratives here. The American story is the Black American story to a very significant extent. The reason that we have a global footprint in terms of culture is largely because of the cachet and the spirit of African-American humanity, which shines through in the American cultural nexus. It shines through on the basketball court and the football field. It shines through in the music studio and on the camera. It shines through. We're powerful people. We're not weak people. They do recognize our humanity in the main. I am aware of mass incarceration. I know you know that I'm aware of mass incarceration.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not telling a cheerleader story here.
That's right.
But what I'm saying is that the gross national product of Nigeria is about $1 trillion, and there are 200 million Nigerians. There are 40 million Americans in a country with a $20 trillion gross national product. We're rich. We're not poor. We're rich, viewed in appropriate perspective. I think we can dwell, if we want to, with certain people. I won't name names because it's not about calling people out, who write books which basically say that they don't see us, they don't see us. But I think, again, that's the easy way out. They do see us in the main, not without the issues that we don't want to lose track of. But it's the wrong way to see the problem, to say that they don't see us. And again, I think it's taking, you say the agency versus, victimization thing is, you want to frame it a particular way. I think it is the question, man. I mean, I think, we talk about disparities. Look at the family. Look at the structure of the relationships between men and women, which is the context within life is reaffirmed and reproduced. You can't say it's healthy. It's not healthy. Now, that's on us. That's on us. And actually, it doesn't matter at some level what these forces are, because if we don't man up and woman up, so I know I'm repeating myself to a certain extent, but you asked me to respond, and that is my response.
No, but I think it's a very crucial one, because I think when Theodros raises the question of how do we talk about a love supreme in the context that you just laid out, though, Brother Glenn. See, I would use Hegel's language. I would say Black people are a world historical people. We are a great people precisely because in the face of 400 years of chronic hatred, we keep dishing out the love warriors who at the highest level exemplify love supreme. See, that's who Martin King is. That's who John Coltrane is. And I keep saying is because the legacy is still alive, the spirit is still there. You see, that's who Sarah Vaughan is. That's who Ida B. Wells is. That's who my mama is. Now, at the same time, though, and this is where I think the complication begins, that we also have to be able to tell a story about why it is that our world historical footprint, on the one hand, which is undeniable, still does not translate into the masses of Black people living lives of dignity and decency. And part of that has to do with Black cowardliness, Black complicity, Black complacency. And that's a human thing. And at the same time, it also has to do with predatory capitalism. It's got to do with vicious legacies of white supremacy and male supremacy. All of these factors and elements are operating such that our world historical print, and I think part of our world historical print is because we're in the belly of an imperial beast. It's the Americanization of the world that enabled jazz and hip hop to become the cultural expressions of the world of the youth because of the disproportionate amount of American influence, American power, and we happen to be on the inside of that power and influence and happen to be much of the democratic leaven within the American loaf to help make the place more decent, more democratic, and so forth. So that all of these different levels and registers and dimensions have to be attended to in order to keep track of our humanity. And yet, I do think that this issue of Black humanity is a very, very profound one because, and in some ways it's true for human beings across the board, but especially for Black folk, because we still cannot downplay the degree to which the levels of hatred and taught to hate ourselves, the levels of doubt, taught to doubt ourselves, the levels of disregard, taught to disregard ourselves, are still operating inside of us. The white supremacy inside of Black people.
So in 1984, the New Republic published an essay of mine called A New American Dilemma. And in that essay, this was kind of my coming out piece as a neoconservative way back. And in that, I made a distinction between the enemy without and the enemy within. So the enemy without was white racism, and the enemy within was African-American problematic internal dynamic of psychology and social connection.
That's right.
Manifests itself in many different ways.
That's right.
And the new dilemma I was arguing was basically that the locus of the problem has shifted from the enemy without to the enemy within. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I'm trying to make a different point. There was an enemy within Glenn Loury. The personal locus of my own spirit and being was diseased, scarred. The connection between that phenomenon of living in the world honestly with oneself on the one hand, and the political issue was one that I had not yet begun to even think about trying to draw. I'm again, because I'm reflecting, because I'm trying to put my finger on some core kind of moral, factors and loci of responsibility. It's a self-regard. It's a self-reflection. Yes. I wanted to be honest. I wanted to be critical. I wanted to get to the root of things. So anyway, thanks for allowing me that.
No, but the fascinating thing is, though, not just I'll get personal too, that you see, one of the things I learned in vacation Bible school is that all of us are thoroughly diseased on the inside. It's just a question of what form it takes, of greed and hatred, of envy and contempt, of hypocrisy. And that disease quality of who we are on the inside must be unflinchingly confronted. You have to be honest and candid about that. You remember that wonderful essay by Kierkegaard, one saying, I wish honesty was a Christian virtue, not just faith, hope, and love. That was one of the last things he wrote. And Rabbi Heschel actually has a wonderful reflection on it in his last book, Passion for Truth. And I agree with that. That honesty, that's more Socratic than it is prophetic in that sense. But it's crucial, it's inescapable. But given that, the question then becomes not to allow our sense of just how diseased we are to becloud what we can see and feel, i.e. love, and act, i.e. courageous struggles for justice. That those particular consequences of seeing more and feeling more deeply and acting more compassionately and courageously go hand in hand with our sense of being diseased. It could be white supremacy inside of us, whatever it is, whatever form it is. But it's basically hate and greed, I think, in the end. But the thing is, once you confront that, and back to Brother Theodros' point, one of the reasons why we love our musicians is because within the context of the Black community, who has been more honest and unflinching in terms of coming to terms with the hounds of hell inside of their own souls than a Robert Johnson, than a Aretha Franklin, than a Billie Holiday, than a John Coltrane, a Donny Hathaway. These are not just figures and entertainers. They are soul wrestlers in the Keatsian sense. Soul wrestlers, folk who are being so candid about who they are as human beings with Black flesh in a world that refuses to in any way be a world that they think they can't wrestle with. Refusing to be victims in the language of Brother Glenn here, you see. And that's one of the reasons why the Black musicians have become so exemplary in all of their humanity. You see,
I'm thinking about my mother, man.
And the Oscar Petersons.
You're preaching. My mama,
giants, man.
The late Gloria Roosley, my dear mother. And I was under the ironing board and sitting in front of the television and whatnot while she was playing her music, her Dakota State and her Eartha Kitt, her Nancy Wilson. And,
Lord,
I mean, and it was all so soulful and it was a wailing cry. but also a hopeful thing. And it was, yeah, it was what you were just referring to, but I was just giving another example of it, of this young woman, single mother.
You remember the
struggling.
moment in Native Son, Richard Wright, about that. Richard Wright so flat, Richard Wright just protest novelist, Richard Wright ain't got nothing positive to say. He got moments in Native Son where he's listening to his mother sing in the kitchen.
Yes.
And what does he say? He says yes. he pulls back, but he's so taken by it, he's sucked in by it. That ain't no seduction of a narrow sort. That's a humanity being completely manifest such that that little Negro genius cannot deny the very thing he wants to deny.
Amen to that.
And that's who we are. And in the end, that's who human beings are across the board. I mean, I've been wrestling with my mother's death, and it's been the poetry of Boris Pasternak.
Oh, I'm sorry for your loss, brother. I'm sorry.
It's been the music of Dorothy Love Coates. It's interesting you mentioned Dakota, because Dakota was somebody who we actually played in a number of the events, because Mom be listening to some on Broadway with Dakota State and down in Washington too. But it was just a matter of being true to Mom. You know what I mean? Being true to what produced her, being true to what went into her in all of her sublimity and majesty, but also with all of her limitations and faults and foibles. She's a human being too.
Okay, now I got to ask you a question. Teodros, forgive me if I play your role here, but I do want to hear about Chekhov. And more generally, because I've read a little Russian literature, not a lot, I read a little bit. I read Brother Karamazov, I read Anna Karenina, I read War and Peace, God Help Me.
Oh, you read the right
I read Dr. Zhivago. I've read some Solzhenitsyn. Something tells me there's something called the Russian soul and that it's not uninteresting.
That's right.
And, all of this narrowness, what color is the author? What color is the author? And I don't mean to belittle anybody, but it's a small way of looking at our intellectual inheritance. So I want you to talk about Chekhov.
Well, I tell you this, though, I think between 1885 and 1920, there were 71 volumes translated into English by a sister named Constance Garnett, 71 volumes of Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Leskov, Lermontov, and it transformed the English-speaking world. Transformed, that's where Virginia Woolf comes from. There's no accent to the press that she founded with Leonard Woolf. She translated Tolstoy too. Why? Because the Russian intelligentsia, which is the first intelligentsia, the French were the second in the European context, the Russian intelligentsia took upon itself the definition of what it means to be human, forms of soulcraft under a vicious empire with mechanisms of censorship. And so they constituted civic life in their work because there was no civil society that was allowed. The empire had crushed the civic life of the budging nation. And so it's no accident that the Russians have the greatest literary tradition of the modern world, not just Europe, of the modern world. That's why when you go in James Baldwin's house, you see Chekhov. That's why Ellison begins with Dostoevsky's Underground Man. That we can go on and on and on. It's not just Black folk, it's Americans, it's Russia. That's why Marquez can't live without Tolstoy. What did the Russians do? They attempted to zero in on the most fundamental questions of what it means to be human: death, dread, despair, and disappointment. That's precisely what the Black musicians did in the American empire. The closest equivalent of the Russians are the Black musicians who did precisely that under a vicious empire of censorship and hatred coming at them. And I would argue that the Russians are deeper than the blues artists. They're deeper than Black people. Chekhov is deeper than the blues. Why? Because the blues is still American, and America's all about the green light, as Gatsby put it at the end of the Great Gatsby. Tomorrow gonna be better. The futurity has a metaphysical status. Future ain't got no metaphysical status. The future can be fascist if you don't get your act together. Black people can disappear if we don't get our act together. That's why Aunt Esther dies in 1985 in The Cycle by August Wilson. I asked the brother, she born in 1619, she died in 1985. How come, August? Because Black people are
fading away. The best of Black culture is fading away. It's getting completely commodified, completely commercialized, completely accommodating to the very thing it was resisting. And that includes the politicians, that includes the academicians, that includes the musicians. Things don't last forever. Magnificent things always come to a close, including even the Russian literary tradition could actually fade away. And so we are here to be witnesses. We gonna bear witness to Art Tatum. We gonna bear witness to Chekhov. We gonna bear witness, and the only reason why we point out in the book, Theodros, the only reason why I think Chekhov is deeper than the blues is because Chekhov does not have a romantic bone in his body. It's all about stamina. It's all about endurance. It's all about Curtis Mayfield keep on pushing. It ain't about the future gonna be better. It ain't about the move toward perfect union and all the other romantic tropes that go hand in hand with what it means to be American. Well, that's all right. There's nothing wrong with being American. We just got to acknowledge what goes into it and what it is. Chekhov is not American. He's okay. Russian. He's
so I got to ask you a couple of questions. One of them, you're not hopeful about the American experiment? You're not hopeful? That's a question. The second one is, how do you square this embrace of this Chekhovian, as you describe it, realism? I don't know what the right word is here, but you say no fantasy, no believing in the fairy tale, facing the fact with that Christian thing that you started this conversation with.
Absolutely.
How do you square despair and with hope?
Two wonderful questions. One is because Chekhov's not a Christian. Chekhov, I'm a Chekhovian Christian, but he's not a Christian. See, Chekhov went to church on Sundays and he cried like a baby, saying it's too beautiful to be true. That he wishes it were true, but he just can't believe it. He's a Darwinian, he's a scientist, and he's a medical doctor. He said very much what you would say about, I got my PhD, I can't believe folks get up out of the debt. Okay, that's fine. Go on with your PhD and work your life out. That's all right. Some of us holding on to a promise, and the promise don't make no sense whatsoever, but you hold on to but what Chekhov has and what you have is prisoners of hope, both of y'all. He is a prisoner of hope in a secular mode. I'm a prisoner of hope in a Christian mode. But at the same time, he's at the centrality of love, absolute condemnation of no one. He got that from his Russian Orthodox church, singing in that choir as a choir boy and being fundamentally shaped by the best of the Christian tradition, even as he accepts Christian love, but refuses the Christian consolation. He accepts Christian compassion. He refuses the Christian conclusion. I hold on to the promise. So in that sense, I'm not fully a follower of Chekhov. I'm a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. But at the same time, the first question that you were, am I hopeful about the American experience? Am I hopeful about the species? Do we have what it takes to avoid self-destruction? That's a fundamental question for the species. I'm a prisoner of hope for the species. I'm a prisoner of hope for the American Democratic Project. As thin and feeble as it is, given all of the imperial white supremacist predatory capitalist forces, yes. Am I hopeful for Ethiopia? Am I hopeful for Eritrea? Am I hopeful for Nigeria? Yes, but with an unflinching look at the dimness. It's like the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The Ode to Joy is about the tears. It's not about the magical possibility of the future. That's something that I really want to hold on to in order to keep fighting. That's what Beethoven says, given the deafness that he had when he wrote the masterpiece, right? That's the kind of thing. Unflinching look at evil, but refusing to give up on the quest for truth and goodness and beauty and the holy.
And where do you situate the American National Project, if I can use those words? There's a huge military. There's massive economic interests that are global.
Absolutely.
There are all kinds of commitments in all kinds of places, including the Middle East, that have historical resonance and that entail the American. There's China. So you had the Cold War. Should we, in our enlightened position of humanism, be indifferent about how the outcome of the Cold War should have come? I mean, would we rather that the ideas and the spirit that animated the Soviet Union have had more sway and more influence throughout the world of peoples of color, or less? Do we believe that prosperity and the capacity to respond to the legitimate claims of the humanity of people? They need healthcare, they need food and housing. It doesn't fall from the sky. You're talking to an economist. I'm not going to waive a PhD, but I'm just going to say there's no free lunch. It doesn't come from nowhere. You need incentive, you need industry, you need investment, you need entrepreneurship, you need the forming of new organizations, you need creativity, you need human aspiration. You need human aspiration. We can belittle the profit motive if we want to, but I'm sorry to have to report as a historical matter, no more effective way of generating wealth has been identified. That experiment was run through the 20th century and the jury is in on that. Look again at China. So, you know, I don't think the line between the normative, what are our moral obligations in the condition of our imperfect humanity, and the prescriptive, what do we do, is a straight line. I will declare that I think the Americans prevailing over the Soviet Union in the Cold War was a good thing for humanity, for freedom, for possibility. I believe it was a good thing. Warts and all, I'm aware of every single wart. And I think it matters. I don't think we can sit this one out. I don't think we can afford to not, you know, you're a democratic socialist. Do I characterize you correctly?
Right. That's true.
So the issue of what's the marginal tax rate, I understand there's wealth inequality. When we get down to cases, the issue of the regulation, you made allusion to the climate problem indirectly just a moment ago in terms of the preservation of humanity. Real decisions have to be made that have massive multi-trillion dollar consequences way down the line. The framework of intellectuality that I bring to parsing the relative equities and becoming able to arrive at a decision matters. They're going to just call me a neoliberal economist because I want to bring the market into play, because I want to have a rational plan, because I realize that the way the price system communicates the information that people need to make efficient decisions is effective, and that's been proven by history. That's a position, it's debatable, but that's a position that I would stake out. So I don't want to ramble here. I'm asking you, who should be winning in the struggle of ideas? Is the American spirit project, the freedom idea, the market capitalism with warts, to be displaced by what? By socialism? By European style welfare state? I mean, you know.
Anyway. I know Theo just want to jump in, and then I can't wait to get in. This is so rich. This is so rich. I'm telling you, this is good stuff. I'm gonna have to turn on my James Brown just to get this moment. Jump right in, though, Theo, and then I'm gonna respond.
Yes, I want to say this, Glenn. The Richmond speech that you shared with me, which I also shared with Glenn and with Cornel. In fact, Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong. There, you are in the process of unraveling something remarkable, which is an internal critique of the limitations of neoliberalism through the lens of revolutionary Christianity, which synthesizes the project directly with that of Cornel. There is a family resemblance between these two interventions. On the one hand, you develop a very carefully worked out analytic examination of the limitations of what I call economism, materialism, as a matter of fact, which you insist is so coextensive with the spiritual that capital is becoming mad in its obsession with economism, and in that it has to be limited with the discussion of the spiritual, of the religious. I call this Chekhovian, as a matter of fact.
let me, I know Cornel wants to get in response to something I've already said, but I got to, and thank you so much, Teodros. Thank you. Man, no, he read my essay, man. 2005, I was in Virginia somewhere, talked to some Christians, because I was still a Christian, on being a Christian and being an economist, you know, was the essay. And what I was saying, okay, so you got a kid, there's the candy bar, he can steal it, he doesn't steal it. Now, why doesn't he steal it? Is it because he did a calculation and he said the cost of stealing it, I might get caught, then it'll be trouble? Or is it because he said to himself, I'm not a thief. I'm not a thief and I don't steal. I say, you got parents and they got children to raise, and you can have a welfare bureaucrat trying to figure out the right incentives about what transfers to make and what not, to encourage them to be good parents. But what could replace them saying with conviction to themselves that they are God's stewards in the lives of their children and they must care for them? Nothing can replace that. I was saying that the reliance upon economism, he calls it, this kind of, I want more, what do I do to get more thing, to the exclusion of the spiritually generated sense of meaning, the significance of life, which would then motivate people to act in various ways. Relying on incentives was really trivializing. There was a part of the human psyche that, the part of the human condition that in principle, incentive-based intervention could not reach. So it was like that. And yes, I related that to the experience to the situation of African-Americans in saying that some of these things that we have talked about in the nihilism conversation, part of this conversation, really could only be reached in this way, could only be reached through the spirit and through the sense of who one is. And yes, at that time I connected to Christianity, although I don't think the argument requires Christianity in order to be a critique of economism.
But I like that Christianity up in there, though. I appreciate that, though. But we, like Chekhov, we don't have to be Christians in order to be love warriors. But the thing is this, though. Let's just go back to
go back.
Let's go back to following Jesus into the temple and running out the money changers, the largest edifice east of Rome, protected by 400 Roman troops, with bankers on the inside and the intellectuals right next door, rationalizing the domination of the poor, and Jesus being willing to run these motherfuckers out. Now, what does that mean in terms of China and Russia and the United States? What it means is you refuse to accept any of the frameworks that lose sight of the preciousness of the least of these. Poor Muslims in China, right? China, repressive, regimenting, worthy of condemnation. Poor people in the United States, in Harlem. U.S. predatory capitalism is failing for them. Even after the communists leave, here come new gangsters with Putin in Russia. China will have new gangsters. So to follow the person who goes in and runs out the money changers is beyond ideology. It is a moral and spiritual practice that has political consequences. So this is where you and I have always overlapped, Brother Glenn, that you and I come from the same Sunday school context. You have been concerned with poor Black folk. You ain't never been obsessed with the Black bourgeoisie. You ain't never been obsessed with Martha's Vineyard. You ain't never been obsessed with status and position. You've been concerned with poor Black folk. You just got market-oriented solutions. And so the question becomes, the moral and spiritual dimension is to be in that temple, keeping track of those money changers or authoritarian elites or arrogant bureaucrats or condescending intellectuals, anybody who's downplaying the precious humanity of poor people, especially Black and working poor people or prisoners. Ain't no accident you spent so much time talking about mass incarceration at a time when it was not popular. You got Angela. Y'all ain't got a whole lot in common ideologically, but you got a lot in common morally. You concerned about these brothers and sisters catching hell on the underside of the American empire. So that's what it is to follow Jesus into that temple. Now, once you then try to understand where the money changers come from, what's the history of, how do we understand the American empire vis-a-vis the Soviet empire? Both empires require certain kind of indictment, but there's no doubt that the American has certain liberties and freedoms that the Soviet empire didn't. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean the American empire is some massive success, and you acknowledge that too. It's been a failure for poor people. It's been a failure for the masses of Black people. That's what Garvey and the others understood. They just had their own responses to it. That's why I can overlap with some of them, because they're concerned about the poor folk who are catching hell. They just got narrow Black nationalist responses to it that I'm highly critical of, because I'm not a nationalist for the most part of any sort. Every flag is under the cross for me. Every flag, no matter what. And what is that cross? Unapologetic, unconditional love, and unarmed truth. And what happens to unarmed truth and unconditional love in the world which we live? Gets crucified. That's what the cross is all about.
I would say that being able to live without a flag is a luxury. I mean, let me put it this way. What are the solutions to take a poor community anywhere, Los Angeles, Oakland, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and you want a decent social safety net. You want investment in their future. You're not concerned about how much you're spending on that. You're interested in on their education. You're interested in their mental health as well as in their physical health.
Absolutely.
You want those children to have stimulation from the whatever. Okay.
That's right.
So you want a robust articulation of social commitment from the state.
Yes.
You need to mobilize billions upon billions of dollars. That can only happen when you tax people. Teodros is showing the book, which is the basis of our country. That can only happen when you tax people. Let me just make my point. You need the political community. There's no global welfare state. There may be in some millennial future that I cannot imagine, but I don't see a global welfare state. What I see is a community of nation states that have arrogated to themselves the power to levy on their citizens on behalf of collective projects, such as taking care of the poor. So if I'm serious about taking care of the poor, I need the nation state. What does that mean? I need my fellow citizens. It means I need some sense of shared fate and common purpose in order to actually achieve the humanitarian goal. So I don't understand.
I didn't say no flag. I just said that every flag is under the cross. That doesn't mean we have no flag. That the very concerns that I have of poor people as a radical Democrat is one in which those concerns came into the modern world in the shell of the nation state. And it remains in the shell of 193 nation states. And therefore nation states are indispensable, but in the end, inadequate, but indispensable context of following that Palestinian Jew in the temple running out money changers. Because it's a moral and a spiritual practice. It's not acting as if we have no flag. It's just every flag is to be measured, evaluated, judged in light of the cross. It's under the cross.
I got to ask you this, man. I got to ask you this because I wasn't there in 1789 in Paris, but I know of the spirit of that moment and I know what came of it. Neither was I there when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, but I also know with the long benefit of history, the spirit of that moment and what came of it. And Mao Zedong could be mentioned here, et cetera.
Yes.
Et cetera. Okay. So it's easy to say, metaphor, turn over the tables. When you actually have turned over the tables, history has asserted itself and it hasn't always been pretty. We could count the bodies. I know that there are bodies on the other side. But what I'm saying is, can we take responsibility for our moralizing by actually embedding it within some concrete institutional evolutionary process?
But that's why our commitment to rights and liberties becomes absolute. That's what part of the critique of the terrorism that flowed out of 1789 and the terrorism that flowed in 1917. But you know, and I know of the terrorism that flows from 1776 with slavery, right?
I'm not going to put slavery on 1776. I'm going to put slavery off to the side of 1776. And now we're going to be into an argument. I'm going to say
1861, they had a chance to come to terms with that terrorism, brother. They didn't.
I agree with that. And they ought to have come to terms with it. They ought to have come to terms with it. And in the fullness of time, it was come to terms with. There was a reckoning. And the consequence of that was the emancipation. I'm saying the emancipation doesn't happen without 1776, as Lincoln recognized, as Frederick Douglass recognized. It doesn't happen without the
I think there's elements of 1776 that certainly contributed to the overthrowing of that white supremacist terrorism and slavery. Absolutely.
I would not compete.
That's what democratic ideals are all about.
But we are the beneficiaries of the historical reckoning with slavery. We are standing here today, in fact, imbued with exactly the rights that we would have asserted ought to have been extended to all human beings. It was not the case at the founding of the country. It has come to be the case in the fullness of time. That itself is worth celebrating, is it not? Certainly, Absolutely. It's not a common experience on the planet.
Yes,
that an enslaved population would come in the fullness of time to
Absolutely.
occupy the position of equal citizenship in the country.
But you would also agree that in terms of the socialist impact on our lives, vis-a-vis elimination of child labor, vis-a-vis not working 7 days a week, the labor movement bringing us the weekend, that was not Thomas Jefferson and George Washington that brought that about. Oh, that's the workers' movement. That's the socialist movement.
Yeah.
We are beneficiaries of that too. The same would be true with the feminist movement and the suffragist movement. That wasn't George and Tom, right? No, that was movements from around the world of women.
And
right?
The freedom for Blacks that I'm celebrating now was the fruit of the civil rights movement, and is exemplifying exactly. And those movements are not independent from one another.
That's right.
And a movement of people for peace in the world that challenges militarism and so forth and so on. Martin Luther King at the Riverside Church, 1967, Poor People's Campaign and so forth.
There you go. There you go. I'm with you, brother. I'm with you.
That's right.
It's I who am with you.
We are with you, Glenn.
So, man, I don't know where to go with this. I mean, I want to ask about Afro sensibility within the global philosophic community. I want to ask about what an Ethiopian philosopher and a Sacramento-born Black American philosopher, the meeting of this minds. I mean, I really honestly, and I'll be absolutely honest with you, everybody should look at this book, but I didn't understand all the arguments in this book, man, because they got a little bit technical.
All right. That's all right.
Whatnot. But here, maybe we can close out.
Teodros is unbelievable talent. That brother's teaching me things all the time. I got to catch up on.
I've got to catch up with you, Cornel. And now we've got the great Glenn, whom I had always admired, becoming part and parcel of a global project, so that we can revitalize an opportunity that was historically created by the inadequacies and failures of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an opportunity to have exercised for the first time in global history a multiracial democracy. We have to return to that incomplete project, and a la Glenn, revitalize discussions surrounding it through the participation of two major minds, such as Glenn, Cornel, George Yancey, Neil Roberts, Paget Henry, Lewis Gordon, Charles Mills. We have some powerful thinkers who are doing first-rate work, aiming at the realization of a failed opportunity, namely an authentic recreation of a multiracial democracy through a global flag.
Well, I'm going to let that be our final word here. I don't want to take too much of anybody's time, and I'm so grateful for you guys to join me here at the Glenn Show. There's the book, Conversations with Cornel West, co-authored by Teodros Kiros, philosopher, professor at Berklee School of Music in Boston, and the great Cornel West, who needs no further description, iconic figure in our time. I would ask you about the tenure thing at Harvard, man, but it would be a downer. It would be a real downer. And here's what I said about that: Harvard needs Cornel West a lot more than Cornel West needs Harvard.
Well, you're very kind, though, brother. You're very kind, though. No, but I'll tell you, I'm giving both of y'all a genuine hug, because you are two forces in the universe who are in so many ways forces of good, and it helped me try to be a stronger force of good, given the cracked vessel that I am.